thank you everyone for being here today for this very important conversation. We are very happy that you're here. We will ask that anyone who is not speaking to go ahead and put themselves on mute. We do know that we have hundreds of people tuning in today to talk about the impact of HB 324 on students, educators, and classrooms, and we're so grateful to have you with us. I will be one of the moderators today, and I'm the Mary Ann Wolf, I should tell you that, and I am the Executive Director and President of the Public School Forum. And I'm also thrilled to be joined today by Ashley Kazoo, who is our Associate Director of the Flood Center. Ashley?
Good morning, everyone. And as Mary Ann said, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. We look forward to the discussion and from the many reflection and kind of takeaways that we're going to get from this discussion and perspectives.
As many of you know, the Forum is a nonpartisan organization that strives to bring together diverse voices to discuss critical issues and provide data and research-informed policy recommendations to support high-quality public education for all students. With this vantage point, the Forum recognized the importance of providing a space to discuss HB 324 with a specific focus on the voices of students, teachers, and legislators in conversation with each other. And so today is going to be a very dynamic day where you will get to hear from individuals. You will also get to hear them ask each other questions, and we are intended for this to be a true dialogue. You who are listening will also have a chance to go ahead and share questions that you have, comments that you have in the chat. And so we hope you'll start by introducing yourselves in the chat. And we actually asked you just go ahead and say who you are and why you're here and why that's important to you. So thrilled to have such a diverse group joining us today as well. We are also absolutely thrilled by the response that we've had with our group of featured participants who have agreed to be with us today in this wonderful journey. We do encourage you to join the conversation with us. We are on Twitter, as many of you know, at the NC Forum or at Dudley Flood Center. We will be live tweeting and sharing throughout this discussion, but we also know the discussion cannot stop here. We simply don't have enough time to cover everything. And so we hope that this will be an important point in this discussion in a meaningful, ongoing way. Love that so many folks are sharing and introducing themselves, and certainly speaks to how important it is that we are together today. I do want to give you a chance to meet the very, very wonderful group of featured participants that are with us, and you will hear from every single one of them today. We are pleased to have lawmakers. You know how busy they are right now. You see all the things that are happening. Senator Don Davis, Representative Ashton Clemens, Representative John Torbett. We were also able to invite several legislators from both sides of the aisle to be with us, and we're grateful that these three individuals were able to join us and are willing to engage in this very important conversation. We also are thrilled to be joined by master educators from across our state. You will get to meet Jenny Bryan, who actually is sick, so you won't get to meet her today, although she may chime in the chat, and she certainly submitted some questions. Jovan Donat, Eugenia Floyd, Chris Lucas, Mariah Morris, Maggie Murphy, Rodney Pierce, Matt Scaldone, Maureen Stover, and Aaron Swanson. And those of you who know these educators know how deeply they work to improve our students' lives and outcomes every single day. And finally, we are joined by several students, Brian Aguirre Santos, Kayla Keaton, Abby Rogers, and Greer Webb. And as I've said, it takes a lot of courage to come and talk about hard subjects, and each and every one of these people go above and beyond. But when we think about our students and when you hear what they have to share, you'll know why I just keep saying they are awesome, and we're thrilled that they are, as they start to embark in the world. Some are heading to college or just are getting started this year. I also want to make sure that we have several elected officials in our audience who are watching today. Hopefully they'll be introducing themselves. A few that we knew that had actually registered before that are joining us include Representative Natasha Marcus, Representative Becky Carney, Representative Julie Von Hafen, Representative John, Representative James Gayard, and Representative Raymond Smith. And we want to also recognize the many other local elected officials that are with us. Thank you for all you do for North Carolina, but also for taking the time to be part of this. We do encourage you for the best webinar experience to choose Speaker View. You can do that, I believe, at the top right of your screen, but it may be somewhere different on yours. So we encourage, once again, the Speaker View. We encourage you also to follow Twitter if that's something that is how you like to engage. We encourage you to participate in the chat. We will be dividing our town hall into 3 segments today. So first you'll hear from students, then we'll hear from educators, and then we'll also hear from our legislators. And they all had a chance to submit some questions ahead, and then they'll get to add them as well. Finally, I just want to reiterate that this topic is very significant and not possible for us to do justice to all the different areas we could discuss. We have 90 minutes. Ashley and I are going to talk as little as possible and let you hear from everyone else and submit your questions. And we just want to make sure that you are ready to go. The other thing I'm going to encourage everyone, something that I have heard and I've actually really reflected on for the past many years, is this idea of listening to understand rather than listening to respond. So often I find myself formulating my response while I'm listening, and sometimes that means I don't fully take it in. And I say this as someone that strives to do this, but is always working on it. And on a particularly challenging subject area, I think that can also help us out a great deal. So that's kind of a ground rule today, if we can all do that as learners together while we're here. So we look forward to continuing the dialogue. We encourage you to see this as one important point, and then we will definitely go from there. So with that, we're going to start with our students. And I'd love to hear from each of our students at the beginning for this first question, just to lay the groundwork with where we are. And as you all know, there has been a great deal of discussion about how equity and race are discussed in schools. Some of you have shared that you have had access to a more diverse or culturally responsive curriculum in your learning environments and experiences. So I'd love to hear more about how did your learning experiences or the lack of those opportunities impact you beyond the class and where you're going next. And Kayla, I'd love to start with you.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Keaton. I went to Middle Creek High School, where I just graduated this past spring, and I'll be attending Yale University in the fall. And at Middle Creek, I had the privilege of taking 2 classes with Mr. Matt Sheldon, who you will also hear from. Those courses were African American Literature Honors and Hard History and Civic Engagement. And those courses were considered as electives at my school, meaning they were optional for students to take. However, after taking both of them, I believe the content in those classes were actually essential and instrumental in why I'm sitting here today. I learned historical points in those classes that I never heard in other classrooms. For example, just the word lynching, I never would have heard, despite North Carolina being one of the top 12 states in the country where lynching occurred. I never would have learned about the eugenics program, where we are second only to California, despite being 1/3 of their population. I never would have learned about the 1958 kissing case in Monroe, North Carolina. I never would have learned about the Wilmington Massacre, which was the only coup d'etat in American history. And those are only North Carolina specific historical points. Of course, we expanded beyond the state. The point of these classes and culturally responsive curriculum is not to sit and wallow in this oppression and struggle and negative energy, and then we're off to second period math. These classes were so unique in the fact that they were solution-oriented, civic engagement oriented, and activism-oriented. There was never a day where I felt like the world was weighing on my shoulders. I actually wanted to do something, and I was encouraged to do something. That's why I'm here today. Let's see. Activism has been a critical part of my life since taking those courses. In fact, it is what I plan to do in college. We cried, I will readily admit, like it wasn't lighthearted topics at all. We cried, we had uncomfortable silence, we had some tense moments, we had to challenge ourselves, but we learned. And every single person in that class walked in ready to face those emotions. And by the end of that class, it was an overwhelmingly positive response, so much so that we begged for a second class and we got it. Which I've never heard of students wanting to take a second class of anything. That is just the beauty of it. It was current, it was relevant, and students wanted to do it. It was not just walking in, getting an A, for some students, even a D in some classes, and moving on and passing the test. We wanted to learn. And that is the power and benefit of these culturally responsive curriculum courses.
Kayla, thank you so much for setting the stage for us. It's really, I always love listening to you and hearing from you. And then I forget that you just finished high school and are going to college, and it just speaks so loudly for our public education system. So thank you. Abby, I'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Yes. So I also attended Middle Creek High School with Kayla. I also took African American literature and the hard history and civic engagement course with Mr. Matt Chaldone. I would also say that, just again, to amplify and agree with everything Kayla said, but also as a white student specifically, taking those classes allowed me to understand perspectives that I would have otherwise never been exposed to. For me specifically, it was my first time being in a class where I was not a member of the majority. I was one of maybe 4 white students in my African American history class, and that experience alone was honestly very injustice and experience that I had never been aware of. I think that the curriculum that is being taught in those classes specifically needs to be spread across the school system and infiltrated in all levels of our education system, like starting with middle school students. I think that if this bill is processed, and the limiting of that education is not only going to make our students less aware of the injustices in our own backyards, in our own community, but it also is going to limit how empathetic we are with our own brothers and sisters, students, and members of our community that we may otherwise not be able to connect with.
Thank you, Abby. I really appreciate that. And as you know, the forum seeks, and the Flood Center in particular, to lift up student voices, because at the end of the day, a lot of the work adults do directly impact students, and that's our goal, but also sometimes it really helps. So I just appreciate these students stepping up and just sharing their experiences, which is what we're hearing today. Brian, we'd love to hear from you too. Again, just kind of an opening on your experiences and what that's meant for you.
My name is Brian.
Brian, we're having a little bit of trouble. Oh, Brian.
And as a student, the only
Brian, I don't know if you can hear me, but we're having a really hard time hearing you. Oh, let's see. I wonder, Brian, if you turn off your. Okay, it looks like Brian might be having some technical challenges. So I'm going to actually ask Elizabeth if you can try and connect with him through the chat, and we'll go to Greer right now, but certainly be ready for Brian to rejoin us, because we want to hear his perspective too. Greer, can you go ahead? Sorry about that. I want to make sure we can actually hear Brian.
Sure, no worries at all.
Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you can mute if there's a phone line or anything that might be causing that feedback. I'm not quite sure. All right, Greer, let's try again. Okay. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you all. And thanks for having us here and for truly centering those student voices. It is really important. I'm entering into my 16th year as a public school student here in North Carolina as a junior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I'm majoring in both political science and African American studies. And so I think it's critical that we have those diverse perspectives. And as a student at Sanderson High School in Wake County, I was able to learn from one of my favorite teachers ever, Mr. Smith, in the African American Studies class there. And so we talked about some of the subjects that Kayla mentioned at the top, and it's crucial that we continue to have those conversations. I like to say often that learning, the best type of true learning, really occurs in the margins when people are come from a place of compassion and understanding and are really pushed to think about perspectives that are different than their own. And so that happened to me. It happened to many of my friends. And so when we talk about race in particular, as we look at this House bill or other subjects, when it comes to the marginalized peoples that exist here in North Carolina, and we know that to be true, teaching that history and laying the groundwork and providing foundations where students can feel comfortable having uncomfortable conversations that are emotional, but that help us to grow as leaders and future generations here in America. I think it's crucial and important, and it's been very impactful in my life. And so as we continue to have that conversation, I think as someone who has gone through the public education system here in North Carolina and benefited greatly from it, some of my best experiences, Kayla mentioned activism. I got my start organizing in high school as well after the unfortunate Parkland school shooting. And that was because of my mentors and teachers inside that high school building that encouraged me to have those tough conversations, to become a leader, to be data and fact driven. And I think it's crucial that we continue to not only have those conversations, but to have curriculums and really a plan that allows us to really teach every student and allows every teacher to be prepared when it comes to these tough conversations, because I think that's really where true learning occurs. And so I won't take up too much time, but I think that when you really look at back to the question, the learning experiences that I've had throughout my time, even in middle school as well, when we really broached those tough subjects of slavery, and even before that, the Middle Passage and looking at social studies in particular, I think it's key that students are able to hear from those that do have a shared history in this country, such as African American students or Latinx students. I had friends of mine in college that were just learning about Cesar Chavez and folks that were involved in the Hispanic movement out in the western part of the United States. And so to have folks that actually have family that have descended from those leaders in America, and to be able to talk about them in an open, no holds barred environment is critical. And so I hope that we continue to think like that and to understand and value the various perspectives that exist here in such a diverse state like North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Greer. And we assure you that we will connect with Brian and get his thoughts out in a different way if he's not able to rejoin us, because we really want to hear from him too. Mr. Sheldon, you raised the fact that HB 324 contains language intended to require that students do not feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress based on their race or sex when in the classroom. So we wanted to hear from students, and what are your thoughts on this provision? Because once again, this is a lot of adults working on this, but we want to hear from students. And what are you experiencing, and what do you think this may change if that language is in the final law, that is, if it is ultimately passed? And Abby, I'd really like to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I think primarily with a bill that uses this language, what we mainly need to be concerned about is, like, how do you qualify discomfort? What does discomfort mean? What does guilt mean? Because if someone wants to make a point that says, I don't want to teach white students about slavery because they will feel guilty that their white ancestors held people enslaved, that's not a logical thought, especially for someone who is in high school. They're not going to feel that type of emotion for an ancestor that they had so many years removed. And I think that honestly, more of the discomfort and more of that guilt comes when you don't know how to respond to situations with empathy and from an educated perspective. because you cannot have conversations that that about critical race theory when you don't even know what that is, and you don't know the history of slavery, and you don't know the history of the Middle Passage, and you don't know the history of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's going to be impossible to have relationships with students, other teachers, etc., if we don't, if we eliminate that from our curriculum.
Thank you, Abby. I always learn when you speak as well, so thank you. Kayla, I think you wanted to share a little bit on this one too.
Yes, so when I first read these words, the first thought I had in my head was which students are at the center of this concern? Because we could have already had an HB 324 when I was in elementary school, and a classmate screamed he hated Black people on my playground. We could have had this bill in middle school when N-word jokes and monkey jokes were like the funniest thing in the world. We could have had this bill when a Wake Forest high school student called a classmate an effing Black piece of S. We could have had this bill when fourth graders were playing an escaping slavery game. We could have had this bill when a teacher in Apex compared a student to a slave. We could have had this bill when Latina students were harassed and bullied about their legality and if they had green cards after the 2016 elections. And those are just examples of what I am aware of and can remember right now. The feelings of discomfort, guilt, anguish, and other forms of psychological distress could sound like a regular day to BIPOC students. It's been going on for years and years and years. And oftentimes those students are belittled, ignored, and gaslighted into believing that they are not real issues. So my question now is which students are at the center of this bill? Because given this political climate, given Senate Bill 3 in Texas that was just passed, given the outrage about critical race theory, given some comments by Republican legislators worried about indoctrination in our schools without providing evidence of indoctrination in our schools, to me, it is very clear that white students and white parents are at the center of this bill, because there's just now a current movement of actually acknowledging and facing our country's history of oppression. And oppression is very hard to be impartial on because it is very two-sided. There's one side doing the oppression, there's another side being oppressed. And there is a way to teach that without hurting feelings, without feeling discomfort in the long term. In the moment, it could be uncomfortable, but learning like a robot and trying to be impartial all of the time, is going to zone students out. They're already zoned out. The way that history is taught is detached from us and impartial with textbooks, but it's also not how you grow. You have to be confronted with outside information in order to grow. And so the language of this bill and what I believe would change, if I read between the lines, what I'm reading is we want to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is really just centering white students, white parents, and their feelings. It's nothing new that I see changing. It's simply doubling down on what is already occurring in North Carolina schools.
Thank you, Kayla, so much for both sharing your personal connections, but also connecting it to policy and what that looks like in such a powerful way. So we really appreciate that as well. I do, as I'm looking at where we are time-wise, and I know Greer's prepared to answer another question, but I'm going to see if Representative Torbett, Representative Clemens, or Senator Davis have questions for our students first, just to make sure. And Greer, I'm going to ask you to go first if the question works for you, but I'm wondering if one of our folks from the General Assembly might have a question that you'd like to ask our students. I have not known you three to be shy in the past, so I'm wondering, Representative Clemens, if I can ask you to put on your educator hat and if there's something you'd like to ask.
Sure, I always try to defer, but I'm happy to be with all of you. First want to say there are a couple of my colleagues that are on that didn't get mentioned: Linda Cooper Suggs, Representative Linda Cooper Suggs, and Representative Cynthia Ball. And I see past Senator Rick Horner as well. So I just wanted to reference them. And I am so encouraged to hear the words and the confidence and the courageous thoughts of the students that have been speaking this morning. And I'm also encouraged to see these teachers who I know to be a bipartisan group of teachers nodding their heads to what we're hearing from our student leaders. And so I'm happy and encouraged by the conversation to this point. As Marianne said, I am an educator at heart. I was at elementary school open house last night with my own children, and so I think my question is, how has this bill and subsequent discussion helped you think about, maybe it's reinforced or thought new things about the role of education in the society that we want to build? So I think this bill and some of these conversations get at the heart of that question, like, what are we meant to do with education in our society? So I think that's my question, Miriam.
That is a wonderful question, Representative Clemens. I appreciate that. And Greer, would you be willing to tackle that one first?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you for that question, Representative Clemens. It's good to see you as well. But I think that education is key. Education, to me, is the first pillar in the equation of true change. And so when we talk about change and when we talk about positive change specifically, and again, looking to our future leaders, our current students, to be the enforcers of that change, I think that education becomes critical. And as Kayla mentioned, I think she made such a great point. She made many great points, but language is very, very key. And so when you talk about discomfort or anguish in this bill, when you just hear some of the things that are being mentioned nationally about the role of education, it really boils down to telling the truth. And I think that students are really good at that. And so I think the role of education, to the point directly, is one of teaching the truth. It's one of preparing those of us that are currently in education, and I think that we're all being educated constantly, but those of us that come behind us, as to what is necessary to create communities that are welcoming, that really uplift the voices of all and allow each perspective of students to be shared. And so when you look at bills like HB 324 and others, I have to admit, to me, they are a bit troubling, because it seems like we're trying to paint with a euphemistic brush the truth instead of getting to the heart of the matter. And so I think that, again, centering the voices of the most marginalized is key. Being able to go to those that have been directly impacted. I mean, I have grandparents that lived through segregation, and to just hear them talk about the ways that people dismissed their concerns is troubling. And so I don't want us to do anything of that sort here in North Carolina, but across the nation. And so when you talk about education, again, I think it's the first step in creating change. And I think we can all agree that change in one way or another is necessary. And so to give our students the tools to become the future leaders and current leaders that we are, the change makers that our state deserves, I think it's critical that we continue to center marginalized voices, that we continue to host spaces such as this one, where we can have these critical conversations, maybe even uncomfortable conversations. But we know that everyone is coming from a place of wanting to create a change and wanting to give opportunity and chances to thrive to the next generation. And so I think that that's really where education comes in for me. As a college student now, just going through and rising up the ranks of North Carolina public education. I mentioned earlier, and I'll end on this point, that North Carolina is a very diverse state. We have so much. We have the mountains, the coast. I believe at last count still the highest Native American population east of the Mississippi. We have a large Black population, Latinx. And so it's important that we have all of these perspectives and that we take the histories of all of these people and include them in our daily lives, because I really do think that learning occurs best in the margins, and that students can really be the drivers of these conversations if we're given the tools, if we're given the freedoms, the academic freedoms to engage with our peers, to be the defenders of our classmates, and to have those uncomfortable conversations, knowing that we have our eyes set on what we want to see in the future. And so I think, again, it's so critical that we're centering students' voices in this conversation, because we're the most important stakeholders, not only at the collegiate level, but also in K-12. The education system was built around and for us. And so it's so important that our say should be equal to those who have been out of the education system for 10, 20, sometimes 30, 40 years. And so I'm grateful for conversations like these that allow us to bridge the gap and allow us to talk about that important point, Representative Clemens, and that is that education is the key to change. And so young people deserve our fair fight at getting all of that, all of the tools we can to build that toolbox of leadership.
Thank you so much, Greer. And I know we're going to move on to our educators in just a moment, but Senator Davis or Representative Torbett, I want to make sure you have a chance if you'd like to ask one final question. And Senator Davis, I see you unmuted.
Thank you so much. Do want to thank the Public School Forum and especially these students, everyone. This is ultimately what it's about. And Representative Clemens and Torbett, at the end of the day, I think North Carolina is going to be in good shape. Who knows which legislative districts they represent in the future. But let me ask Kayla a question, if I may. As a legislator, someone who would be concerned about students, and we have over 1 million students in classrooms across the state. And I was listening specifically to some of those instances that you shared in your remarks. I'm just curious, put 324 aside altogether, in your opinion, based on what you are aware, how did the education community respond to those, I would say, offenses?
So thank you so much for your question. I'm very honored to get a direct question from a legislator in our state. In terms of how the education community has responded to those instances, in some cases it received statewide attention through headlines and news articles. And of course, because of that attention, there were some consequences, some suspensions of teachers, obviously negative attitudes towards certain students that were in viral videos that could be identified. I'm sure that they had a tough time with those, but there are also other instances that were just completely ignored and swept under the rug. I remember my first example of the kid screaming he hated Black people, and he also said he hated girls, so as the only Black girl in the class, I felt targeted twice. I remember very clearly that it was basically nothing. I remember seeing the tears of one of my classmates who heard it and asking what happened, and he told me. I remember that all the kid got was a talk to the principal, which in the long run, what did that really do? I remember talking to friends about our discussions in our AP classes where we are in majority white classes, and there's our feelings of discomfort, hearing about our classmates talking about illegals, hearing about our classmates using derogatory language, viral pictures of our classmates and athletes in our school using the N-word to refer to other students. And a lot of times, if they get enough attention amongst the student community, it's a lot of reposting and a lot of negative attention that students on the offensive side do not want. Being labeled a lot of things as a racist, which if you are using certain language, I think that is valid, but a lot of times it happens online and it may never get to an administrator, it may never get to a teacher. And once students have those experiences and we know who is doing what, it is one of two things that may happen in an education community. One, we do not talk. And what I mean by that is when we are in a classroom with certain people, it's, oh, I'm not going to speak up in this class because I know who is here. And I don't feel like having them respond because I know what they're going to say and what they feel. And I personally would prefer to censor myself in exchange for not feeling that discomfort of what I know that student will say. So that is creating a negative environment that I believe BIPOC students are especially aware of. I think more aware of than any other students, because when you're receiving those on the receiving end, you have to be aware of it. And it also means that the opposite side may not even be aware. That means this is now normalized. And that also means if it's now kind of normalized and it's not brought up to teachers' attentions, what can they do if they are not aware, if they don't know the extent of things? And so I believe that is what the education community's reaction is either normalized and it really does not get addressed because people don't feel comfortable enough to, and it's kind of maintained. And if it is brought up, if it is very bad, I know some teachers who are very good at addressing it as best as they can, who will sit down and have those conversations because they are in that mindset of trying to create those communities for all students. And I'm extremely thankful for those teachers that I've had in the past. But there are also other teachers where we acknowledge that based on some of their behaviors, some of what they've said in class, even something as subtle as not recommending certain students for higher level classes, we already shut them out. We already do not talk to them. So it's really who is doing what, where are you? And that will greatly affect the response. Like it can go from classroom to classroom.
And Kayla, you actually provide in that question, Senator Davis, a perfect transition as Ashley's going to talk directly to our educators, which you know is something we really like to do at the forum, is always lead with our student voice. So we'll next get to talk with our educators. But I also really appreciate how you all have broadened this to be just about issues that we're tackling in schools every day, and you all being so brave to share your experiences, but also appreciate the questions that are being asked. I also want to,
Can I jump in just real quick? I'm sorry, before you move on to the next
no,
segment.
Representative Torbett, I'm sorry.
No,
yeah,
you're fine. You're fine.
We definitely, please go ahead.
Kayla, Abby, Brian, Greer, thank you so very much. Greer, I think I see you in the halls of our state capitol every now and then down now. You're the big, tall fella. Kayla, very articulate. Congratulations on being accepted to that Ivy League school. I'm sure you'll have a great time. Study hard, do great things, but also have a little bit of fun. Abby, thank you so much for the input. I'm going to offer you guys something. I don't know when you depart for college or anything, but if any of y'all are in Raleigh or just want to pick up the phone, I would love to continue our conversation beyond this Zoom, because I do desperately want to hear your impact. You're very articulate. You're very spoken from the heart, which really rests on my heart too. Would love to hear much, much more from you, a one-on-one. So please feel free to call the office. If you're in the area, we can set up an appointment. You can come by. I might get us a sandwich or two too. So feel free to always drop by and have that conversation. I look forward to it. I can only learn from y'all's experiences and other experiences of my constituents. Thank you for the opportunity to listen to y'all today.
Thank you, Representative Torbett, and we can make sure to share contact information with all of you here, so we can help to facilitate that as well. And again, love that this will be the beginning of many conversations. So thank you. With that, Ashley, I am going to go ahead and turn it to you. I did want to call out that Brian is having some challenges with Zoom, but he's actually able to chat. And so our student Brian is providing some input on these questions. And Brian, I know you're out there. I encourage you to keep doing that and we'll work with you. So Ashley, with that, thank you for the gift of time. We wanted to hear from students, but I think we're in great shape because we still have a nice 50 minutes left to talk with our educators and then our legislators directly as well.
Well, I mean, there is not much to say after that wonderful discussion. I just want to point out and highlight, because I think this is something that we miss sometimes, is that all of these students are a product of our education system as it currently stands. This is the product of the educators that you will see and hear from in the next few moments. This is the system that we have set up. And so I'm blown away. I've been blown away, and I'm very grateful for everyone to be a part of this conversation. But again, I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to go into the educators, and I want to just formally thank you all for joining us. We're going to jump right into the questions. So to begin, let's talk about, just some aspects that they brought up in that conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about your approach to diversity and how you utilize various perspectives in your classroom? And how has this curriculum in your classroom impacted your students in terms of their learning experiences? And I'm going to start first with Eugenia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here today. I really appreciate the Public School Forum and my fellow educators for even allowing me to have a space in this room of wonderfulness. I just especially appreciate the student voices in this discussion. I know that the beginning of the year has started, and one of the first things I do when I start my school year is I ask my students, what do you need from me to be successful? And yes, I ask my fourth graders that every year because I want to know how they see themselves. And I think that's important and vital for the conversation. Also, I too, like our students on this call today, am a product of North Carolina public schools, and hearing the experiences that our students have faced and, overcome and have really thrived through are much similar to some of the same ones I experienced as well as a student in the state of North Carolina. Now, I graduated back here in 2005 from high school, but even knowing that in 2021, we have this room to grow is important for us to recognize. So thank you so much to the students for sharing that. To answer your question, one of the things that is really important to me is acknowledging and uplifting the diversity and various perspectives in my classroom is a necessity. My number one priority as an educator is the safety of my students. And this safety includes facilitating and fostering a classroom environment that celebrates all of who my students are. Every child has the right to see themselves in the classroom, in their curriculum. And I, like all educators, want to make sure that this begins in the first few weeks of school. Now, as a fourth grade teacher, we do this I have the kids bring in me bags. And in these me bags, my students have the opportunity to bring in or draw or show us pictures of the things that make them who they are and show their class what's important to them. One of the other things we do, and many people know, I teach literacy. And as a class, and even in small groups, we read text together, we read books together. And when we do this, we ask students to share their perspectives. This is important, and it's also very important to implement those best practices as an educator. We have programs and curriculum like Socratic or Paideia seminars, and those are fantastic ways to allow students to discuss a text, listen to one another, and respectfully agree or disagree. It also allows them to take charge and responsibility of their own learning. And teachers get to facilitate this conversation. We monitor the students' understanding, and we watch students practice the skills of seeking understanding from one another, even when they disagree or agree. That type of learning experience is not just building skills for the classroom, but also beyond it. And that's what I think we can see has happened to many of the dynamic students that we've heard from today, where they have been given this opportunity and it's been fostered within their classrooms so that they can speak on the things that matter to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I appreciate how you pointed out that, teachers are able to facilitate these conversations in the classroom. Maureen, I think you wanted to jump in on this question as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Ashley. And as I was listening to our students speak, I just made me so excited because they are so articulate and so passionate, and they are products of our public school system in North Carolina. And just as Ashley stated, that means that we're doing things right here, but we need to continue doing things right. And we need to make sure we're supporting our teachers and giving them the ability to do things the way that we need to do them to help support and educate our children in the best way possible. And so, I was a very unique person coming into education because I didn't start off as a teacher and I started off in the military. And when I got to the Air Force Academy, straight out of high school, that was the first time that I was around people who were different from me. And I was very fortunate to be with people from all 50 states and all of our territories. And I quickly realized that there's a lot of amazing things that happen that I wasn't aware of. And there was so much culture within our country that I didn't know about. And so it became very important to me as I transitioned into education to bring those lessons that I had learned in the military with me to ensure that I was being culture responsive to all the students in my classroom. And as Eugenia said, to make sure I was celebrating all of my students and making sure that all of my students saw themselves in our curriculum and saw themselves in our classroom and knew that their perspectives were valued and that they were in a safe place where they could talk about themselves and they could talk about their families and they could talk about their traditions and where their culture was going to be embraced, not just by me, but by all of their classmates as well. And a lot of people ask me, as a science teacher, how are you embedding culturally responsive teaching practices into your curriculum? And I'll admit that, like, as a social studies teacher or an English teacher, that might be a little bit more organic, but there's ways that we're able to embed culturally responsive teaching practices and embracing each of our students and celebrating each of our students in all of our curricular areas. So one of the things that I always do at the very beginning of the school year as I'm teaching the macromolecules unit is I have kids bring in food from their own homes. And we look at how we can categorize those into carbohydrates, or how can we categorize those into lipids, or how can we categorize those into proteins? So they're learning the science standards. But along with that categorization comes organic conversations as they work in small groups about, why do we have this kind of tea at my house? Or why do we have this type of flour at my house? Or why do we eat this kind of rice at my house? And so we're able to start building this community within my classroom where my students feel comfortable talking about themselves, sharing their culture, and then I'm able to build on that. So as my students move into physics and we're doing fluid dynamics, I teach about Bernoulli's principle, which is why airplanes fly. So when we are talking about Bernoulli's principle, I embed a project about the Tuskegee Airmen. That bridges my culture coming from the Air Force with my kids' culture. And that means that I'm also able to help them celebrate some amazing American heroes, but we also look at, why were the Tuskegee Airmen separated? Why weren't the Red Tails part of the normal Air Force squadrons? What were some of the problems that existed for those Tuskegee Airmen? And what were some of the hardships and some of the discrimination that they faced as they were flying in World War II and supporting the other American pilots? And so I think having opportunities like that, where we are looking at celebrating culture, but also identifying places where things have not gone correctly in America's past, is very important. And as I listen to these conversations, I'm frequently reminded of the quote, "Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it." It is very important that we identify places in American history where we have not been as encompassing as we should have been, where we have discriminated against certain groups of people, where we have not taken the opportunity to really pull together and to celebrate all the unique diversity that we have within our nation. It is critically important that as educators, we are educating future generations to understand the importance of embracing diversity, to understand the importance of celebrating the multiculturalism that we have within our nation, and to find ways to celebrate each and every one of our students as the unique individuals that they are.
Y'all have me speechless, and this does not happen most times. So I thank you again so much for your perspective on this. I think you hit a lot of the great points that we wanted to highlight. I just want to offer room for Educator to please jump in on this at the end. And then also I just want to say, I know that our student participant Greer is going to put in the chat some things he wanted to expand on what Maureen was saying from his perspective. So any last educator that wants to jump in on this question, or we can move forward. All right, I will move on to our next question. So we did have a couple of questions that were submitted in advance. And so this was a question from our student, Ms. Kayla Keaton, and I'm going to summarize it a little bit, but I wanted to put this out there to you guys of, based on the 7 concepts that were established in HB 324 that shall not be promoted by public schools, what historical areas, topics, movements, historical points, and or current events might be inherently prohibited from this discussion in classroom as a result of these 7 concepts that should not be promoted in public schools? And we are going to first go to Rodney for that, to answer this question, if you don't mind.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to the Public School Forum for this event. I'm very honored to be here and very happy to hear the perspectives of not only my colleagues, but of students and legislators in this discussion. When I think about those concepts and what it may prohibit me potentially teaching in the classroom, I have to go to one of the most divisive or divisive, however you prefer to pronounce it, events in the history of our country, which would be the Civil War. And there's a lot of jargon, a lot of, talk about the rationale. What was the reason? It was tariffs. It was the nullification. It was John C. Calhoun. It was slavery. It was this, it was that. But would this bill, if passed, prohibit me from saying this in my classroom? And I'm going to read it to you. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. That's the cornerstone speech. Alexander Hamilton Stevens, Vice President of the Confederacy. So when you say, concepts that promote, one person feeling inferior to another person based upon their race or their gender or things of that nature, it makes me think, okay, maybe I can't talk about the cornerstone speech. Maybe I can't give people the real reason, straight from the horse's mouth for the Civil War being fought, for the Confederacy being formed. Would I be constrained to not talk about that? And if a student or a parent or family members feel bothered by that, because if I bring that into the classroom, trust and believe, I'm going to talk to my administrators beforehand, before I bring it into the classroom. As the only Black male K through 12 teacher in North Carolina who worked on the social studies standards and the unpacking documents, I know it's going to fit under the standards because I helped write them. So it's going to be within the standards. And if I bring that to the classroom and someone feels uncomfortable or someone is bothered by it, I don't mean to be harsh, but that sounds like a personal problem. That sounds like something that that student or that parent, they need to reconcile amongst themselves, because this is a historical truth. This is no fallacy. This is me not trying to push any type of ideological agenda or political agenda. This is verbatim what this man said. And so when you when you attempt to push within a bill, certain concepts not being able to be said because it makes one group of people feel inherently inferior or superior to another group of people simply by the verbiage in what's said, then it makes me feel like, okay, I can't talk about the cornerstone speech in a state which, along with Virginia, lost more soldiers in this war than any other state in the entire country. And while I'm very, very happy to see our student voices, these young men and young women who have articulated themselves so well this morning, I know all three of those students did not go to Halifax County schools where my students attend, where my children are growing up, my biological children. And I think about Leandro, so let's throw that in there too. Can I not talk about Leandro? Can I not talk about the demographics and the things that have been said in relation to that case? In terms of, the lack of action thereof upon the General Assembly. I was a sophomore in high school. I know Ms. Floyd talked about, 2005, I'm 96. So I was a sophomore in high school when that case was filed, and so, I look at these young men and young women talking today and I'm so happy and promised, but then I think about kids I taught who simply, don't have that gift or that talent or that skill to articulate how they feel. They get angry. And why? Because they don't have the resources that provides them with the educational structure that those young men and young women receive. So not only are you not providing the resources that they need to get an education of that type, but you're trying to restrain and constrain the voices and the expertise and the scholarship of teachers such as myself and my colleagues who are on the call this morning from teaching these historical truths. So I'm very bothered by that, very bothered by that. And I'm bothered by the fact that a lot of times these bills are being pushed by people who've never taught a day in their life.
Thank you for that. I think we have another educator who wanted to jump in on that question.
Yes, I'll go ahead and jump in. I'll start off by saying thank you so much to Public School Forum as well and Student Voices. I mean, your voices by far the most important in this conversation. The public education system is for you. So I'll piggyback off of what Mr. Pierce had said. Obviously, the Civil War, and the fact that it was fought over slavery, and it's not coming from us telling the kids this, is coming from those documents like the Cornerstone speech, is coming from every single one of the secession letters that we can point out specifically in those primary documents. And I think one of the things that is so troubling with this bill is that it takes away the trust in the educator to be the facilitator, to show the children how to be proper historians, to seek the multiple perspectives, to gather the truth from those perspectives from the past. And to have those discussions. But to expand upon that, I mean, there is not one decade in history that is untouched by this bill. You go into, post-Civil War, you go into Reconstruction, to Jim Crow, Black codes, slave codes, Wilmington, the Wilmington coup, the massacre. You go into the fight for the 19th Amendment, Trail of Tears. There's not one thing that is not going to be touched here. And the problem here is that it would alter the narrative. For example, the Wilmington coup, I'm going to pick on that because I am from Wilmington. I proudly teach in Cumberland County, and I see a couple of my other Cumberland County educators here in the panel. But growing up, I was not aware of the Wilmington coup to a certain degree. My father was a history teacher, so I was, to some degree, I was aware, but not to the full extent of it until I sought out the information myself in college, and as well picking up this amazing book. I'm sure that some of my educators know about Wilmington's Life from David Sakino. Knowing the full scope of that narrative will completely change, because I'm afraid that if I am teaching about the Wilmington coup, it's taking out the why. And that's the most important things when we're discussing the perspectives of historical events of the past, is the why. Why did this happen? And so it would stop me from explaining the role that white supremacy played in the coup, the response to the duly elected a Black government in Wilmington, and the fact, which obviously is not a single event, that is just some tragic atrocity that never happened anywhere else. Tulsa. I mean, so many different communities were touched by very similar events. And the whole point here is that the reason why I don't know about Wilmington is because of the systemic approach to take it out of the curriculum, to construct the narrative around it being, it was a political movement. It was simply to take out corrupt politicians, which no proof of that being. I think, honestly, with HB 324 here, at best it's willful ignorance, and willful ignorance is dangerous alone when creating policy, because you can't truly create policy in true good faith without knowing the full scope of history and the atrocities that happened to every single American citizen. And then if you choose to censor certain events because of the role certain groups played, then you are right then showing to those students that being an ancestor of the marginalized group and currently marginalized, that your perspective is not as valid. Your perspective, your feelings are not as valid. And I think there's a lot of different repercussions from this bill, and it would change the narrative for a lot of the social studies teachers. And what I am also fearful on is that it would stop a lot of educators from teaching in North Carolina. It would stop a very, I mean, look, if I want to teach history and if I want to teach truth and teach my students how to be historians, but knowing that I can't tell the truth in the full scope of these perspectives, then it would be hard to do that. And this is not a, I mean, on so many different levels, but this is another end, not a good recruitment tool to get the best and brightest in teaching. And, you know, voices like our own here with the student voices. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And you guys have been really highlighting some really great points. I do want to shift over to Matt, to give a little bit of more perspective on this question. I do want to just highlight that we are short on time, and I want to get to every question because this is a great discussion. But after Matt goes, then I will make sure that we can try to get to our third question and maybe any possible questions from the audience or our legislators. So Matt.
Ashley, thank you so much. Thanks to you and everybody at the Public School Forum for hosting this incredibly important conversation. I am entering my 20th year of teaching, and I've been the guy dumb smiling through all of the student comments. I'm so proud of all of those kids for showing up and participating in what we do. All of these things have to do with them, their potential impact on them. And the fact that they are here making their voices heard means the world to me, and I know all the educators and legislators present. But to speak to Kayla's question, Kayla was asking about if you look at those 7 specific concepts in HB 324 that say that things that a public school system or a teacher could not promote. If you look at some of those things, the idea that we cannot promote the idea that a race or sex is inherently superior to any other race or sex. We cannot promote the idea that an individual bears responsibility for actions committed in the past, or that we cannot promote that an individual should feel discomfort, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress solely by virtue of his or her race or sex. Let's go ahead and say it first. That isn't happening anyway. There isn't an educator who is promoting any of those ideas actively in our classrooms. So what we're really talking about is, are we really trying to say we should not promote these ideas or we should not discuss these ideas? Because that is a whole different thing altogether. As Kayla mentioned earlier, if our BIPOC students can experience racism in our schools, then our white students can learn about racism in our schools. If one set of students is having to go through it themselves, another group of students could at the very least have a conversation about it. And the concept that discomfort should be removed from the educational process. To me, that is the moment where the most educational growth happens, is a moment of discomfort. Ask any of us in the room, when we were first learning algebra, we were all frustrated and we were all uncomfortable and we pushed through it. I didn't entirely, but most of us pushed through it. Discomfort is a part of the learning process. And if we learn to get a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable and maneuvering through those spaces together with the students in our class, then we can actually do something. Then we can lead to some real breakthrough moments of self-actualization for these kids. But specifically to Kayla's question about what could we not cover, that if HB 324 goes forward, what are the things that are going to be swept off the table? And my peers have pointed out issues having to do with the past. I would like to focus on the present. That I think if HB 324 goes forward, then teachers are going to be even more wary than they already are to help our students understand what's happening to them today. To me as a teacher, the idea of maneuvering a group of students through the year 2020, 2021, and to not make any mention to what happened over the past year and a half in our country and around the world, to not talk about George Floyd and the protests that followed, to not talk about the pandemic, to not talk about the election, to not talk about January 6th. To me, that is the equivalent of educational malpractice. That our students, we heard about the idea of the Wilmington coup of 1898. If students had an understanding of that, then they could more effectively process what happened on January 6th. That they would have a historical framework to put that present day moment on. But instead, too often, we just act like the outside world isn't happening, and we keep our focus entirely in the past. I'm not saying that any of our educators should or do stand in front of a room of kids and tell them what to think. But we absolutely have to help them process the world that they live in. It is up to them to come up to their determination of how they think or feel about these things. To be honest, My opinion in my classroom is the least interesting thing that's happening in that room. It is the opinions and thoughts and feelings of my students that are the most important thing in that room. So to Kayla's question, what gets swept off the table if HB 324 goes forward? I fear it's helping our students process their own present. Thank you.
Again, you guys are highlighting a lot of great points. I do, knowing that we have to move on to our legislative portion of this conversation, I want to offer an opportunity like we did with the students. Are there any questions that our representatives or senator has that they would like to ask our educators that are here right now?
If I could just clear up maybe a few pieces here. It seems what I'm hearing, I support almost everything I'm hearing. And when I say that, I mean anything. I'll go to Rodney, I'll go to you. You mentioned about concerns about what you can teach, what you can't teach, quoting historical figures from the past. And you can teach any and all of that. We actually need more of that being taught so we don't go back and repeat our past. I like the idea that the focus on North Carolina history. I'm originally from Tennessee. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of history out there. If it happens close to you, it makes it even more personal and even more solid, if you want to think. So if you're a North Carolinian and you hear about these events happening in North Carolina, like the Greensboro City and the drugstore, that kind of stuff, you hear about that, you can go see it today. That makes it oh so real. So yeah, I deeply appreciate that. And don't read past the language of the law. We're simply about promoting things that are inherently bad for the future of this state and for the future of this country. So anything that's happened in the past, you can teach it. You can teach it so our kids will most definitely understand it was bad, it was evil on the bad parts. And hopefully you can find enough good in history too to promote some of the good, or to teach some of the good parts of our history as well, because on both sides. And also bear in mind, a lot of this comes from constituents. And we have constituents that feel a little bit different than some of you guys feel. And I understand that. That's how we're made up. We're able to talk about it. We're able to listen to it. And we have the freedom to do such because of those people that came before us to provide those freedoms for us. Always talk about our history. Talk about our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our people that made us the people we are today. To me, that's history. And we don't teach our kids enough about the people that got us to where we are here. You're bold, you're brave. Thank you for each and everything that you do for the kids of North Carolina.
Thank you for that. And we do want to open up again. If Don Davis, I do say that Senator Don Davis, you do say that you unmuted. So do you have a question for our educators? I'm sorry, Senator, we are unable to hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm sorry about that, but I have a spinoff somewhat to Matt's one of his points. He said that to his knowledge, there's not any teachers that are doing this. And I want to further emphasize and clarify a point that Representative Torbert's making. I believe you see a different bill in 324 in the Senate versus the House. And it clarifies that you can teach the good and bad parts of history. It also goes on when it talks about promote. I want to be very clear in here. It says promote with the legal definition of compelling a student to believe a certain thing. So Matt, you said that to your knowledge, no teacher was doing this. I would go further in my question to you and ask all of the teachers who are here in all of the years of experience that you've been teaching, do you have any knowledge where a teacher with the intent to compel a student to believe that they needed to go overthrow the government, do you have any knowledge of that occurring? And if so, what happened to them?
To be brief, no. I have never once heard of that happening in my 20 years of education. If we could compel students to do exactly what we wanted them to do and to believe exactly what we wanted them to think, we would probably start with things like compelling them to get to class on time every day and to turn in every assignment that was assigned to them every day and to come prepared to class. If we can't even compel them to do that consistently, I do not think that I don't think so highly of myself that I believe that I can rewire a child's brain to, after spending just 90 days in a classroom with me, that they're going to leave and go overthrow anything. The only thing I am there to do is to help a student find their best self and to find ways to express that and to live up to their fullest potential. That's it. But compelling them to overthrow the government, absolutely not.
I do want to offer just a chance for Mariah Morris and Javon Donat to speak on this one as well.
Thank you, Senator Davis. That is an excellent question and point you are bringing up here. I want to frame that question in the larger schema of teacher recruitment and retention. So in North Carolina, we know that we are trying to recruit and retain the state's best leaders to educate our children. And in the classroom, our teachers are tasked with large responsibilities. We're in charge of our students' safety, their emotional well-being, things like learning disabilities and data collection to identify major gaps. But yet, we have this sense of distrust amongst our teachers that's shining through with this bill. And when I think about one of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou, that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they're never going to forget how you made them feel. And in this bill, there lies this distrust of our educators, and yet we're asking our educators to do these very large, life-changing things for our students, like identify whether they have a learning disability or keep them safe or make sure that they're emotionally taken care of throughout the day and at home. And so I think as a state, we have to decide, do we trust our educators? And if so, why would this bill even be necessary?
And I would actually like to add I used to be a classroom teacher, and now I am the equity lead with Cumberland County Schools. When I think of equity, as it's been stated before, our state has tremendous diversity. Our district has tremendous diversity. So I think of racial diversity, but when you think of free and reduced lunch, we have 78% of our kids are free and reduced lunch. We have kids who are differently abled. We have AIG, 5% are ELL. We have 85 native languages spoken in our district. And so I say all of that North Carolina is very diverse. Cumberland County is very diverse. And the fear that when we embark upon this, it's a quelling effect upon the teachers. They can't teach history as history was. It is what it is. But also from a district perspective, there's a portion in it that talks about contracting with hiring, otherwise engaging speakers, consultants, diversity trainers. There's a quelling effect upon people who do diversity and equity work, who do cultural proficiency work, that train teachers and staff in how to manage the vast diversity of our students. And if we're really concerned about our students come first. It doesn't really, how people feel, that's important, but every single student in that classroom matters. When you have 73% students of color, they matter. When you have LGBTQ students and they may be 7% of your population, they matter. We need to train teachers and every person who works with students to respect them and affirm them. But part of that demands that the history be known. I think there's a way, and this comes into training, that we train teachers to deliver material in a way that a child isn't shamed, that a child isn't humiliated. It doesn't matter what group did what. What matters is that they're taught the history and how do we make responsible, moral, logical choices in the future so that we don't repeat history. We've got to teach children proper history. We've got to teach them proper civics. We've got to teach them how to be upstanding citizens in a society and to understand and respect and acknowledge all the various people in the society. And so I think one, when I look at this bill, the quelling effect upon teachers that they just can't teach with liberty at something that they are experts at. I saw a statistic that behind engineers, education has the most highly educated workforce. We are extreme experts, and it's saying that they don't know what they're doing. Why not trust them to do what they know how to do? But then also we work with those who are new to the discipline, those who don't really know, so that they can convey history and information in a way that it isn't making a student feel shameful or humiliated or something's wrong. No student should ever walk out of a classroom feeling that way. Our job as educators is to help students that when they walk out of a classroom, like we see with Kayla, like we see with Greer, like we see with these different students, they walk away empowered, impassioned, they're articulate, they're knowledgeable. They aren't walking around with this weight of guilt on them, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, their sexual identity or orientation. I think that's what we really need to do. And I guess one, it's a quelling effect, but it's not allowing educators to be who they are. And then further, when you think of Leandro is coming. How do we handle that? How do we address injustices when we can't even speak about them or acknowledge them? Acknowledging them doesn't have to come with a guilt and a condemnation for the present. It just comes with, let's move forward into the future with opportunity and with a positive outlook and to grow and build our society and our people. That's just what I think. As a district perspective, when we do our equity work, we're looking to build, grow the capacity of teachers, grow the capacity of staff, grow the capacity even of our students, that we are better functioning people.
Thank you so much for that. And we, again, Marianne said this at the beginning of this, there is never going to be enough time. As Representative Torbert mentioned, we encourage you to utilize that offer that he made and have a conversation with him if you want to continue that with our educators. But we do want to make time to just ask some questions of our lawmakers that we have here today.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And Erin, I'm going to circle back to you at the end because we haven't had a chance to hear from you. So would love to hear kind of your final thoughts as an educator, and then maybe Greer and Kayla, kind of that 1 minute at the end. I'd love to hear from you again as well. But to our legislators, you've been so wonderfully engaged in this discussion, and we appreciate it so much. And you know that we have almost 1.5 million K through 12 students who are very diverse across our state. And so as we prepare for this school year, you know, we were saying after the pandemic, but clearly still in the pandemic, how do we best support the academic, social, and emotional needs of our students in what we teach and how we teach it and how we care for them? And I'm open to any of you starting that question and obviously tying it to this important discussion. Senator Davis, do you want to start?
Certainly. I want to first say that there are enormous challenges that were taking place in our state regarding education prior to the pandemic. And as we have now been going and enduring this pandemic, John, you know this, Representative Torbert, and Ashton, Representative Clemens, we're working hard right now, you know, during the pandemic just to respond. I mean, there's enormous concerns with learning loss. There's enormous concerns with the impact ultimately that there will be on promotion, the greater impact that this would have on workforce and ultimately the economy. You know, even on, I mean, we have students now that would have been returning back to the classroom that's not been in a classroom, some in a year, over a year. So when we're dealing with these challenges and look at the pandemic in itself, this is an ACEs event, an adverse childhood experience in itself for these kids. And obviously, I believe a response warrants us making sure that there's adequate support staff in schools, whether that's social workers, psychologists. It means that we should make sure that we're tackling how we return the kids back to school with the Delta variant being before us. It means that we should do everything ultimately to keep the kids safe, to establish a safe environment, because if the environment's not safe, I don't know how you learn. And I'm saying all that to say we have all these challenges before us with the pandemic, and we're sitting here talking about Senate Bill 324.
Thank you, Senator Davis. And yes, I really appreciate that. And I saw a lot of discussion about budgets that are being released and, and how that also exhibits our priorities and where that goes. And it's interesting to see that people are really looking at that and actually asking that exact question, given especially the current time. So I really appreciate that. Representative Clemens, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think it really all boils down to we believe in our public schools and our public school educators. We believe every single child in North Carolina deserves our best, and we invest in our public school educators and our public school children. Period. End of story. We take away barriers. We do not distract them, and we trust them. Certainly. I mean, I was a school principal for 8 years. We hold them accountable. No one's saying we don't. But we, as a state, if ever there was a time where we ought to be focused in education on what matters, which is outcomes for kids, it is now. And to me, that looks like taking away distractions, investing in and supporting in our educators and our children. And, I'll be filling in as an art teacher for a maternity leave in a school, because all of us who say we do that, if ever there was a time to put our time and our talents and our money where our mouth is of supporting our schools and children, it is now. So for me, that's what all the policy debates and all that, that's what it boils down to in this moment.
Thank you, Representative Clemens. Thank you for bringing it back to that as well. And Representative Torbett.
Yeah, I was getting asked and I was yielding to my colleague there. But number one, sort of like Senator Davis was saying, the question that originally stated, now that we're exiting the pandemic, unfortunately, we are still in the pandemic. We are addressing some serious critical issues. And a lot of that is still the unknown. We don't know what's coming totally around the curve or over the next hill yet. God, if we only knew that, would be a lot easier. Some of the things we are talking about, and one thing I just like to focus on, I hear a lot about diversity, and we are diverse. We understand that. I don't hear as much talk about what unites us, what brings us together as men and women focused on our children, trying to get us advanced. And I'm a grandpa. And most of you probably don't know, I was PTO president of every school my daughter went through except for high school. So I was extremely highly active with teachers and with parents and with students going through my daughter's process, even to the point where we paid for and installed, PTO paid for and installed the first computer lab in an elementary school in Gaston County. And that was 20, 25 years ago. Only to find out we didn't have a teacher that could teach us. So then we focused on getting teachers trained up to teach computer labs. I mean, that was the day. So extremely active and extremely respectful of our teachers. What are we doing? I was honored to serve as chair of a school safety committee starting 4 years ago. And it didn't take long for me to understand the main focus is on on mental health in our kids in our classroom, and how do we address some of those issues that pretty much equate to every issue we're facing. And so one of the aspects of that is dealing with emotional and academic and social needs is have more professionals there to assist our kids when they need them. And so one of the goals we're doing, and I think hopefully you will see in the next couple of days, that where we're putting funds to that. We have to have the assistance when a child needs it. We have to have assistance there no matter where they are in North Carolina. And I mean from the mountains to the coast, rural, urban, it doesn't matter. A child is a child in a classroom. We have to have professional assistance there. So we're focusing on that to work at all of the main keys, the academic, the social, and the emotional needs of the students is what we're trying to focus on as far as additional funding. I learned a lot of lessons through school safety about the social and emotional health, and understanding then that if we can use peer-to-peer, we can increase that knowledge working. Most people who in here actually listen to their parents more so than their friends when they were in school. Chances are you listen to your friends much more than your parents, right? I mean, that's just the way things are. So if we can also incorporate some of that peer-to-peer to help with these social and emotional needs, I think we can gain yards on that. And y'all know, Kayla, you're a prime example of someone that should be mentoring folks your age and that are having problems. And you probably already do, you just haven't said that you do. But you're a prime example of that. Greer, I know you're around here somewhere, but I know you're a prime example of doing that. And I'm sorry, I don't know the rest, but we have to use it. We have to use peer-to-peer and try to aid and assist our fellow folks. I'm trying to look at the question of best support academic, social, emotional needs of students. We teach how to teach them. I can't tell you how to teach them. I'm not a teacher. I haven't been trained to be a teacher. I will tell you that I do have ultimate respect for you guys, but also bear in mind the job that I have rests mainly on responding to people that I serve. And if y'all have a view, believe it or not, there may be people that have views differing from you. And my job is to how do we collectively get the best for the most and have a good, solid outcome. And in this effort, we have to have that solid outcome because we're dealing with our kids and the future of North Carolina. And I thoroughly understand that.
Well, thank you, Representative Torbett, for sharing that, and also your connections to education throughout your daughter's career as well. We appreciate that. And I know I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat about how in some ways, I think some feel like this bill may go against that, like what you're saying. And so I think we're appreciating your openness and your invitation to hear from students, because there may be other ways for us to think about some of these subjects. And I think today we've heard the courage, and I know we're almost out of time, and I want to end with our 2 teachers that haven't spoken yet and our 2 students, of course. But Representative Herbert, I hope this is the beginning of more conversations with you and Representative Clemens and Senator Davis and the many legislators who are on this call today, along with the educators and students here, because there's a lot for us to think about and learn. And sometimes these are not simple issues, or we would have solved them, and they are complicated. So
I would just appreciate if everyone read the bill. Don't read past the bill. Don't read into the bill. Just read the bill for what it says, and then be happy to send your comments to me.
Okay, I'm sure you will get more comments from that, and we can also pull the comments out of the chat. But I do encourage folks to do that. And I think as we think about this bill, which is in our legislature right now as we speak, and as you all know, while we're also going through the budget process and other things, I do want to end. We haven't yet heard from Aaron Swanson and Maggie Murphy, who have done significant work in this area. And then I like to end the way we started, which is with our 2 students. So this is kind of sprint, Aaron and Maggie. I hate that, like a minute each, but I want to hear from you all, and for at least that, and then we'll continue this discussion. Aaron, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Marianne. And I want to hear from our students too. So I'm just going to be very brief and just say that, I am in Edgecombe County, and, we deeply believe here in Edgecombe that our aim is to ensure that our students can all become the architects of their lives and their communities. And that we know that if that's going to be true for all of our students, that we have to ensure that every single child is affirmed in their identity, that they know our collective history, even if it's difficult to hear. That's something that's so incredibly important for all of our kids, and that they understand that we are always, we are in this together, and that if we're going to move forward, we have to be in this together. And so just really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, to hear from so many phenomenal folks, including our wonderful teachers and our students. And I will stop here so we can hear more from them.
Thank you. Maggie?
Yes, thank you so much. I'll be brief as well. I'm so appreciative of all the voices that have gone before me. I think that everyone should have Mr. Matt as their teacher. So I'm starting with that, Mr. Matt. I also am from a rural county in North Carolina, Allegheny County, and we're in our 4th year of global education, and it's made all the difference in our very rural setting with the diversity and cultures and the appreciation of all of those things. So I think that we do need to move forward. I agree, but my very final question to leave with is how does this bill unite us if that's its goal?
Oh, Maggie, I think that's going to take another town hall. That is a very important and very big question, and one I hope we'll continue to ponder together. Greer and then Kayla, I know we only have a minute each, but I want to just make sure we return to where we started this discussion. Greer?
Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone that attended this morning. Now we're in the afternoon, but it's been a great conversation, and thank you especially to the legislators for listening. I'll try and be brief. Just a few points here to wrap up. I think that the point of this conversation that I've taken away from educators, legislators, and students is that students deserve truth and students deserve the tools that make us strong leaders. So we're just asking that we're given what we need. I think budgets and laws often reflect a legislative body's priorities. And so surely this bill cannot be your top priority right now in the legislature. I do hear you, Representative Torbett, and like I said in the chat, I'm down to march on back to my hometown of Raleigh anytime and have a conversation with you, but I am reading the language of the bill, and I think that's important. And so the piece that says students shouldn't feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish, I felt anguish, and I could argue psychological distress when I learned about the Holocaust, but we don't seem to be talking about that right now. And so who are we centering? That question that Kayla asked is so important. It's so important. And so just to build on that, education is the first pillar of true change that I mentioned earlier. The other two to me are protest and raising your voice, and then policy change. And so we're now at that third step. So the ball is in you all's court. And as I said earlier, I'm a very fact-driven person, and I believe that every Republican in the House voted in favor of this bill, and every Democrat voted against it. And so, like I said, I'm always down to come back down to the legislature and discuss, my experience with you. And I just hope that you in particular understand the importance of this moment and understand the weight that you and specifically your Republican colleagues, the power that you all have in this moment. So who are we centering? And I think students and educators alike are crying out to give students what we need. And I think that's been made very clear this morning. So thank you all, and thank you to the Public School Forum for giving me the opportunity to share my perspective.
Thank you so much, Greer. And I'm taking notes as you all talk, and I appreciate that so much. Kayla, you're going to get the final word before we wrap things up here.
Yes, thank you. First, I want to thank everyone here today in the Public School Forum for giving me this opportunity. My plan to study education policy at Yale, so when I graduate, I will be coming back. My lasting note is that today you heard from 4 exceptions. I'm not all the glowing remarks, and being called a prime example is great stuff for my hair, but 4 exceptions. 3 of us went to school in the same district. 2 of us went to the same high school. No way this is a general result of education in our state. 1.5 million students, we definitely do not represent all of them. And why? Because not every student afforded the resources, afforded the teachers, and afforded the culturally responsive curriculum to be in this meet, to be on this call, and to be talking to today. I think my lasting question for those watching and legislators is, would you like to produce more of us? More than single digits, I think would be a great goal by the time I come back. Thank you so much.
And Kayla, we're thrilled you're going into that. And, I think there's going to be a lot of us trying to recruit you to come back and work with us. And of course, Greer, and let Abby know that too. So we're all delighted. And Brian, who's joined us and been gracious in the chat. There's a reason we started by saying this takes courage to be here. And I do want to commend our 3 legislators who were willing to be part of this important discussion with educators and students. The easy answer was no, I'm not available. And you all chose the hard answer. And we are grateful for that. And we're also grateful for all of those elected officials who were joining us today in the chat as part of this. And, you know, it's an overwhelming number when you really think about that. And I know many others would have liked to. And so, you know, to our students and educators, you're brave. You're sitting here telling us like it is. And there is something here. There's a lot of truth in what's been said here. And what I hope is that we're all brave enough before we just go ahead and move forward with something that clearly needs to be looked at and considered and asked a lot more questions about, that we're willing to take the time to do that. Because the key is it's our students that matter, our 1.5 million students. And those are just the ones in our schools today, right? I mean, we have Greer and Kayla's graduated and Abby's graduated, and you know, we keep going. And so I just encourage, and I hope that this is part of a conversation. The forum does not think this is where it stops. We do have Color of Education on October 26th and 27th, but I know we can't wait that long to have more discussion about this. So we'll be in touch. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. This will be available as a recording, and so others can be part of that. You all know that we're on here, that we will have be able to have pieces of this on Ed Matters, but really the key is I'm just seeing sharing like crazy on social media, and I just cannot thank each of you enough for giving your time and your energy and your thoughtfulness and your bravery to this discussion today. Thank you.